I want to find out if there's any threads that you see going on there that you can maybe trace to the shows that you've been involved in. Damien?
Well, it's, I suppose the reason why these are Gothic films, and we're talking about Gothic films and Gothic television, is because we have a camera involved. And the camera tricks are very kind of, I mean, one of the things we did in Being Human was when we were talking about the devil played by Phil Davis, was the camera told his story in a very, it was a kind of a camera on a slider. I don't know what it did something very, and that signified, it was kind of his trademark shot. And you can see there that the camera is used in a very, very skillful way, because these old films, they're using, I suppose the beauty of Gothic is these are normal circumstances. There are shadows everywhere in life, but if you put a camera on a shadow, suddenly it takes on a whole new meaning.
Sure.
And in the same way that you see, yes, I mean, it looks grainy and it looks slightly dodgy, but the camera is still very much telling the story. And I think that's the same for, obviously the same for TV today, that the camera is still a very useful technique to terrify the audience.
Sure. Lily, what did you make of that?
Yeah, I agree. I think an actor can do so much, but it's never going to be the same without clever camera work, makeup, costume, and music. And it's the same principle that we use now, it's just more advanced technology, really.
Sure. I mean, Farren, you work with Lily on The Fade. I mean, is it from a director's point of view? I mean, again, what do you make of that? I mean, are you seeing directors doing similar things that you would do now, but just maybe with less money and more primitive equipment?
I mean, there's a very simple aesthetic to what we just saw, I think, that in some ways I think was relevant to The Fades, because one thing that I specifically wanted to do with The Fades was to try and make it feel, have a sense of realism, however heightened the concept and the conceit was, but to try and make it feel potentially possible, as ridiculous as that sounds. So what I set out to do was to try and do a lot of the effects in camera, so it wasn't heavy on visual effects or scenes and sequences that were completely created through visual effects. They were just sort of the sprinkling on the top. So with that regard, I can see, you know, a lot of similarities because obviously when these movies were made, visual effects weren't around, so everything had to be done in camera. So there are similarities there. I think the one thing I kind of noticed from that, there's a real reverence about the way those movies were made. They almost feel religious and a kind of, you know, I guess a theatrical nature to them. That I think perhaps has been lost in the way we make sort of horror today. I think we've gone down the sort of entertainment route a lot more. I almost felt I was in a church watching those, and I'm not sure I feel that way when I'm confronted with sort of modern day equivalents, really.
I mean, Anthony, I wanted to ask you in particular about Dracula there, because obviously Buffy was one of the shows which kind of completely revitalised the vampire as a subject for horror. Looking back at that Dracula, I mean, are there bells being rung with Buffy?
I mean, the one comment, we have learned something about pace since those days. Thank God. The Cleopatra clip or whatever it was, just like, you know, just going back to the same shot doesn't quite work. No, interesting. Was it Louis Jourdain? The actor. Interestingly, he was playing it. He was underplaying it, and this selection was very interesting. Billy Whitelaw, Ian Holm, all comparatively realistic, and actually David Hemmings, who was not the greatest actor in the world, but he was playing it. He was underplaying it. I mean, this was an interesting choice, because, you know, Hammer horror. There was an awful lot of pushing it and overplaying it, and, you know, like the guy screaming at the end, who wasn't underplaying it. But, you know, bless him, doing his best. It's an interesting, you know, ultimately, you know, what we have learnt is that if you undersell it, you can get more. And one of the things that you know, that Joss Whedon, I don't know whether he's the only one, but he was certainly a forerunner of bringing comedy and humour into it, so that you so underplay it that it takes the audience by surprise when you turn it on a dime and actually there's a thrill or a horror.
I mean, for those of you who've been in front of the camera and those of you behind it, I mean, is that something to do with TV and the differences between doing horror and Gothic on TV and horror and Gothic on film? Because you're right, I mean, the obvious comparison there, you think of the era, is Hammer, and Hammer you associate with a certain level of overstatement. And as you say, what sort of jumps out a little bit once you get past the creakiness is all very kind of downplayed. I mean, is that TV? Is that something about TV, or is that just a kind of a strange quirk of those clips?
No, I think that's just the fashion at the time. I mean, Hammer horror basically was just reflecting, and it's interesting that the original Buffy movie, that the Kazooies pretty much turned Joss's script around and said, no, we don't want that kind of sardonic, ironic humour. The humour, if it's going to be anything, is going to be schlocky and slightly over the top, campy stuff, which is why the film is a very, very different thing. Now, that's not because it was a film and Joss is, and Buffy was a TV show. That's literally, that was the popular conceit. That horror film didn't have funny, any real comedy was kind of outlawed. You had to have this campy kind of not taking itself seriously, tongue-in-cheek, over-the-top performances. And I think we've moved on from there, thankfully, and I think partly or greatly thanks to Joss Whedon.
I mean, thinking about writing, actually, it's a question for Toby and for Dominic. I mean, obviously what you've got there are stories which are direct adaptations, in the most part, of the classical Gothic. You've got Robert Louis Stevenson, you've got Mary Shelley. As writers of the new Gothic, do you feel a thread to those stories and to those writers?
I think weirdly, I would say yes, as British writers, because I think that, and I've talked about this before, that I think that within the UK, and not just in horror, but within science fiction as well, we have a very kind of noble tradition of suggestion and implication, because the budgets for British shows have always been very meagre compared to American shows, which has meant that we've had to find slightly more ingenious ways of creating atmosphere and creating tension and horror. So, for example, one of the big influences for me when I was growing up was Sapphire and Steel, which is a very, very cheap sort of chamber piece kind of show. But what was terrifying about that was that you would very rarely see the monsters. You would hear the scratching at the door, but you would never see. Because the thing is that what you can create in your own mind is infinitely more frightening than anything the special effects departments of that day would be able to create. So I would hope that that's something that certainly we carried on in Being Human, again, because our budget was so small. So we had to be very inventive. We had to make it a character-led show, because character is the one thing that's free. Everything else costs money. And so, but again, the horror had to be implied a lot of the time. And it had to be a suggestion and an atmosphere and a tone, which again, I think is something that we inherited from the Gothic era. But again, you look at those clips and they were, even the very effective ones, you can see how cheaply they were done. And that's in no way to denigrate them. On the contrary, I think that it means you have to be so much more ingenious. And invariably, by being more ingenious, you tap into something much scarier and much more kind of moving and profoundly scary, which I think is a very good legacy to carry on.
Dominic Mitchell, I mean, how much do you feel within the flesh that you're an heir to Mary Shelley and to Bram Stoker?
Yeah, definitely. I think, one of our references was, it wasn't on here, but it was James Whale's Frankenstein. That was a big thing for us about humanizing the monster and things like that. So definitely we've got a big kind of tip of the hat to that, I think. And also kind of looking at that, because we wanted In the Flesh to be, we wanted to have that grainy feel, we wanted to have that cinematic feel, we didn't want to, like we were saying, kind of rely on special effects, because special effects are very expensive, and it always kind of looks a bit rubbish compared to the great big American shows. So we kind of wanted to do a lot of in-camera work and a lot of makeup work and things like that, because I think that's what British crews are brilliant at, doing that kind of thing. Yeah. I
mean, I'm just wondering, thinking about those clips in total, whether there's something in the idea that at that point Gothic was kind of about the monster in the human. So you had Jekyll and Hyde as the kind of one that was the definitive Gothic story at that point, and that maybe that's something that changed. I mean, we'll go on to move.
But also, I mean, if you look at Dracula, it's really curious reading Dracula as a grown-up and reading it with an understanding much more about. And basically seeing much more of the psychology that was behind it, and the fact that you kind of realise this is a book that is about the fear. It's the fear of the foreigner, it's the fear of women, and the fear of menstruation. And you kind of think, shit, I didn't realise that when I was 14. I probably, I was too busy watching terrible horror films. But that's the thing. Kind of as we were saying earlier, horror becomes a way, much like science fiction, it becomes a vehicle for doing a different story. It becomes a way of, the way that science fiction in the 1950s became about the fear of Soviet invasion. And so horror particularly becomes a route and becomes a channel for telling a different story and exploring a different theme.
I mean, we saw in the clip there was always a kind of complexity, really, to being human and to the character of Hal. I mean, how deliberate was that, or how much was that something that evolved over time? Or was that part of your idea from the get-go?
I don't think anyone would ever set out to create an uncomplex character. I think that you always want, and kind of as Anthony said earlier, you want, what makes a character is the conflict within them. And so it is, and as Damien was saying, it is somebody with a kind of overwhelming bloodlust versus their desperation to resist it, and from that comes the drama. But yeah, the complexity was kind of there, but it was brought to the screen beautifully by Damien, and yeah. But as I said, it's always the intention to kind of to make your characters as complex and as in a way as difficult for the actor as possible, because that's how it's going to be satisfying.
How difficult is Hal to play in that case, Damien?
I don't really see it as difficult. I see it as a real joy because there's so much that Toby gave me to play with, and the world that, I come into my trailer and there's an 18th century uniform. I was wearing a tweed suit yesterday, and I'm working in a cafe tomorrow. It's that kind of thing. So, but what I always loved was making it real, and I've said it before, but I did so much kind of work when I was working on Hal about just about drug addicts, and I remember filming a scene in the pawn shop, and I had to walk across, and I've been watching. I really wanted to develop the character from a very historical period, because the character is a historical character. I've never seen Twilight or Vampire Diaries of True Blood. I will watch them one day, but I've always kind of based it on Nosferatu, and I watched Shadow the Vampire and Dracula and all that kind of previous stuff, and I suppose that slightly dictated the character when I was rehearsing in the room. I was kind of walking across the room like Bram Stoker, and it doesn't work because obviously of the modern setting. But it's kind of to be able to bring all aspects of the historical vampire to life and to play all these wonderful scenarios that Toby has given me it's a joy as an actor.
I mean, when you were creating the show, Toby, obviously, the hook, I guess, is that you have a vampire, you have a werewolf, you have a ghost. And obviously there's always been a comic element to being human, but with that kind of makeup, how difficult was it not to lapse into full-on comedy? Because, we're probably about the same age, and I remember Rent-A-Ghost on TV, which was this kind of lovely children's comedy about a similar kind of setup, but Being Human's always had a darkness too, so how tricky was that to pull off?
The thing is that weirdly, I didn't use a different style of writing for Being Human than I do for Doctor Who, or than I did for No Angels, or for the show I'm working on now. Forgive me if anyone who's heard me say this before, but basically my belief is that life doesn't exist within the tramlines of one style or genre. Life is a mixture of tones and styles, and if you are having a conversation with something, that doesn't mean that it isn't possible that something either very comedic or very tragic can then happen. I think life is quite funny, and I wanted to make it as realistic as possible.
I mean, that's the writer's perspective, but Farren and Lily, obviously The Fades, again, was a show which had some very, very funny moments, but also had there's a real intensity to it, and real kind of themes of good and evil coming out there the whole time. You're directing, you're starring in the thing. How difficult is that tightrope walk between the darkness and the comedy?
I think that was the toughest challenge. I think two challenges with The Fades. First and foremost, it came out trying to create its own mythology. We're all aware of zombies and vampires and werewolves and how that all works, but no one really knew what a fade was and the mythology behind that. So that was key to sort of get across. But when I first read the script, it was paramount that it was a curious mix of sort of fantasy horror, straight relationship drama, and sort of teenage kind of angst humour. And I loved it for that reason. But I think with shows like The Phase and Being Human, the skill is being able to blend that seamlessly within the writing, within the directing, within the performing. So that was, from my perspective, perhaps the thing that I had my eye on the most, so that it didn't feel like it was three separate genres clashing with one another, but it all felt very natural, because quite often you use humour. If you're shit scared, you use humour to counterpoint that. And I think these shows really use that to great effect. And certainly with The Fades and a character like Mac that Dan Kaluuya played so brilliantly, his point of reference was always to do with, with comic books, graphic novels, and humour, to sort of take the edge off what he was terrified of facing. And so I think that the success of the film was of the series was largely down to that sort of current of comedy running all the way through. It made the characters feel very real and very natural.
Well, I think you always care about characters more if they've made you laugh, because that immediately makes you like someone. So if then something horrible happens to them, you're going to care more than you did if they were just a depressing character that then smiled.
But Dominic Mitchell, I also want to talk about In the Flesh, which is another great show, and also entered kind of earlier this year into what is in many ways a kind of crowded market. There's been this history. How did you give In the Flesh the kind of distinctive voice that it has?
Well, yeah, I mean, I wanted to do something that was very, very domestic, and that was very sort of, I mean, In the Flesh isn't really a supernatural show. The only thing that's supernatural about it is that the dead rose, and that's the only thing that's supernatural. And I thought that was an interesting thing to have, that nothing other happens that is supernatural, but people in this village want to believe that it's supernatural. And they're kind of, because we do, don't we? We want things to be magical, even if they're not. So it was sort of a science fiction show, and I wanted to do something that I was always like, well, I'd seen like zombie apocalypses movies, like I'm a massive fan of those, but I'd never seen what happens like when the dust settles. You know what I mean? When people kind of get back to normal, and perhaps, and I was always thinking like, what would really happen in a zombie apocalypse? Well, like the scientists would try and manage it, or try and cure it even. So yeah, no, I just wanted to know what that would be like, at 5 years down the line, when this zombie apocalypse, when everyone's sort of just stumbling about, and so that's what I wanted to kind of do.
Anthony Head, I want to talk to you about Buffy, because Buffy, I mean, I think is the daddy of them all, really, in this context. I mean, when you first joined the show, what did you think you were getting into?
Well, I when I read the script, I took it with me to a Tex-Mex restaurant in Santa Monica, sitting on my own, pissing myself laughing at this script, and at the same time couldn't wait to turn the page. It's a sad image, actually. And I said to a friend that I really want this show, and the character read as somewhere between Prince Charles and Alan Rickman in Robin of Sherwood, and I asked Joss when I was auditioning. I said, "What do it looks like one of the two. What do you want?" And he said, "Well, give me somewhere in between." My agent, just before you have to, for the network, you have to you do a test, and you basically go in, you sign the contract, and then you go in and you audition for hundreds of executives, sort of floor to ceiling. They're all sitting on the everywhere. Anyway, my agent said, "Why don't you watch the movie before you go in on it, just to get an idea of the feel of the show?" And it was a completely different thing, altogether different. And thankfully, I saw Joss on the way in and said, "Oh, I watched the movie last night," and his face fell, and he said, "Don't panic. This is a different thing. This is," and thank God, because it was not what I'd read. I'd read something that was witty and sharp and incisive and scary, and what the movie was schlocky and campy and just a completely different thing. Same world, totally different take. But you still don't. You never quite conceive that something is going to be that big. And I think it still has a voice and still is big, because Joss did that amazing thing of pulling the plug. 7 seasons, it had a finite end, and things like X-Files kind of just dribbled away because they just kept making them. Buffy never did that. It finished, and so there's our little baby out there to be seen by people.